I would like to invite our guest, Professor Werner Oechslin, to the fourth final lecture of the Ornament series organized by Oliver de Meissen. Unfortunately, Oliver cannot be with us tonight. He's poorly and in bed, and he's asked me to introduce tonight's lecture. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Professor Werner Oechslin, who has an illustrious academic career, having taught in several international universities, including the Free University of Berlin, MIT, Harvard, and been the head of the History and Theory of Architecture at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, ETH, in Zurich. He is also the founder of the Werner Oechslin Library Foundation in Eiseldown, in Switzerland, which opened in 2006 and is a building designed by Mario Botta and holds a remarkable collection of more than 50,000 books, including many architectural rare volumes. I believe the lecture tonight will address the work of Andrea Palladio, which of course is extremely topical given the amazing Palladio exhibition at the Royal Academy that I encourage you all to visit. Please join me in welcoming Professor Werner Oechslin.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? I try to speak slowly. Anyway, my English is not as it should be. I'm not used to it anymore. I rarely speak English. And you might interrupt me. Interrupt me if you would not understand. And I try simply to introduce you to an issue which is quite, let's say, up to date in the right moment. The Palladio exhibition opened here, and I didn't yet see it. I know that it is spectacular from the point of view of what you can see, the original drawings. And on the other hand, I know, being part of this concilio in Vicenza, that it is an ongoing debate whether Palladio is just a historical phenomenon or if you should deal with it in a different way. And I would now try to introduce it this way, to look at Palladio from a modern point of view. And to introduce it, I would simply say it is rare that such a prominent historical figure was continuously used, given interpretations, understood, transformed, retaken up, and so on. It was very rare. Most of the historical figures somehow were dismissed. Le Corbusier made this famous drawing where he puts a nice lady, sunshine, and says, Vignola est foutu. Vignola is gone, it's over. We have won. The modern has won over or against history. This was the common way of considering history. In order to be able to go into modernity, you had to overcome history. And it's very different in the case of Palladio. Palladio did not object. And I start by making a short introduction to the different ways of approaching Palladio. I will then try to see what actually Palladio's own reasons would have been to overcome his history. And we could then say, is this important for our concerns? I would then try to see where the specific modern approaches have been in looking to Palladio, and finally we will then see that we still have some problems with modern and history, and that we still did not overcome this crisis. So this is all about the next 50 minutes. I have some nice images for those who would not understand what I'm saying, but I choose them carefully in order to try to illustrate the analysis I'm trying to give. It's not easy. I did a whole book on that, and the book is not easy neither. And again, I start now by saying, let's look these first two images. They both are from the late or by the end of 18th century. Should I say something about that? That's the moment when seen from a modern point of view, historical consciousness is maturing, is developing, whatever. And we have two very different approaches in these images. We have here a portrait of Palladio, but the portrait actually is of that guy. This is Ottone Calderari, who is that architect who at the time of Canova, the time of 1800, is considered to be the most eminent scholar of Palladio, who comes very close to the original buildings of Palladio, who is somehow the second Palladio of that time. On the right-hand side, you see an image, which is a fiction of different Palladian buildings, the Basilica, the Ponte di Rialto, the Palazzo Chiericati, different buildings combined in a fictitious image, which is in a very different place. And this too is an approach, which we could say it's an approach by image. This is approach by identification of one architect to another, and I give you a short illustration. Calderari, as I said, is an architect in Vicenza, in that town which is determined by Palladius buildings, and he finds himself in this task to somehow to conclude or to bring to an end or to bring to perfection the Palladian tradition, so he really identifies. And you can see that this image, this painting puts it. He is like, let's say, so he is in modern clothes and he holds the hand of Palladio, who is then with genius, being crowned, whatever. So it's dedicating himself to the overall authority of Palladio, whom he tries to equal. This is the issue. And to give you an idea about the enthusiasm, which at that time was so normal, I quote from the little Elogio, when Calderari, still young, died in 1803. Diedo, who was an eminent person in Venice, one of the rulers of the academy, would then tell about a little anecdote, and the anecdote goes like that. Passeggiava, I say it first in Italian, passeggiava egli di notte a fianco di un dolce amico al chiaror della luna. So he says that there were some young guys, friends, emotion, and in a night, and they saw this building, the Basilica, in moonlight, and they got even more emotions. And then Calderari said to his friend, "Quanto mi piace tal fabbrica." He doesn't say this historic order or this is made in Italy. Quanto mi piace. It's an emotional saying. Dovremmo studiare l'architettura, amico. So it's that particular moment of history when you have this moralizing way of going into history. And you speak about telling all to the youth, you would educate people. And the architect has a moral duty to educate. And Palladio would then be the inspiration for a moral education of young people. It is all about emotion. If you know how Canova was treated in those days, it's actually absolutely the same. It's morality. It's not morality. It's the moral values. It's value anyway, and it's emotion. And these are brought into identification and brought into an architectural ideal. So this is about equation or identity, or this desire to coming as close as possible to the genius of Palladio. This other attempt to go to Palladio is very different. And the anecdote in this case is the following. Algarotti, who was an eminent intellectual in Europe, very friend of England, helping the English Academy to become famous. And Algarotti wrote a letter. He wrote so many letters. In one letter to Mr. Pesci in 1759, he says, altre volte, he says, I remember sometimes when we had a bottle of wine, we had this little discussion about the doing un nuovo genere di pittura per riunire belli edifici tolti qua e là o ideali. He says, we thought about making some kind of new type of painting, and we would take buildings from that place, from another place, and taking these different buildings, they became ideals as they are in a fictitious place, you know. So he takes then the case of the Canal Grande in Venezia, takes the bridge, but not the built bridge, but the bridge as conceived by Palladio. It is his drawing, never realized. And he puts the basilica, which did not stand here, but stands in Vicenza, as is the case of the Palazzo Chiericati. So it's a capriccio. It's a capriccio. It doesn't. It has nothing to do with reality. It is idealizing. It takes some of the most outstanding images of buildings of Palladio and brings them together in order to depict an ideality of Palladian architecture. So you see, both paintings say something about approaching the hero or approaching the genius of Palladio. In one case, on a very personal way of going into that personality. On the other side, going into those configurations which refer to buildings which were done actually by Palladio, or at least thought out. This is about approaches to Palladio. Another approach is simply going to visit all those buildings, as many did. Starting by Inigo Jones, starting by the Englishman, traveling there. Visiting the building is still the best way, you would say. And one of the most eminent visitors of Palladio in Vicenza was Goethe. And Goethe describes very carefully what he felt when he went to Vicenza. And it is very clear. He immediately said, okay, I know him from books, but these books do not matter anyway. You can look up in the library if you want. But now I'm here. I can touch these buildings. There I am. I see them before me. And he says, or he comments that, I read it German first, wenn man diese Werke nicht gegenwärtig sieht, hat man doch keinen Begriff davon. He says, if one does not see these buildings immediately, physically, one cannot have an idea of what one has there, you know. And in a different text, he's more explicit about that and says, only if you have a physical approach to those buildings, you can have a sense of Wirklichkeit und Größe. So the physical real size gives you the concrete dimensions. And only then, says Goethe, you can see what is behind. And he says, by going to this physicality, says, Palladio must have be ein großer Mensch. So he concludes from this physical awareness of architecture to great man. Now, it cannot be different. If you have these buildings before that, you finally can have an idea what is behind there, a great man. Griffigkeit is the issue. You can touch at it, you know. Griffigkeit was a notion by a German philosopher, Plessner, in the early 20th century, by which he described not only the physical approach, but he described also the approach by your sight, you know. You see, and your eyes are catching a thing, you know. Your eyes are going into the physicality of a thing, and your eyes are helping to get a correct understanding on the side. So it's quite clear all over history had this possibility to go to Palladio himself, to his ideal architecture, to his genius, or to his buildings. And then you had still another possibility. If you couldn't travel, you went to his books. And it is so clear that for all about Palladian tradition, you have always this dichotomy. You have buildings, and then you have these books, you know. There were so many architects who only had access to books and made their opinions out of the book, and naturally had the others who also saw the buildings. It's an exceptional case where the fame of an architect is made so in such an important way by the books. Okay, these are the two natures of Palladio. You have the building as it is, and you have the way Palladio renders these buildings in his Quattro Libri. Is this known? Quattro Libri is the title of those books. It's a difficult history. It was published finally in 1570, and you could say it's the first book who has such a rigid, disciplined way of representation. All the schemes are drawn in the same way. They are very simple drawings. They are not modern modern engravings, but they are xylographs, wooden engravings. They are rough, but still they are very disciplined. They are all drawn up in the same ways. They are all based on the classical ways of dispositio, according to Vitruve, ground plan, orthographia, section, as Daniel Barber wanted it to have. And they are the main thing in that book. This is the content of the books, the xylographia, the representation. When you look to the text is only some kind of footnote in most cases. He adds some text to identify a building, to say, yes, we had this kind of problem, or he identifies some spaces, and then he has some small introductory text. He says by himself, I don't want to speak long time. There you have the images. I'm an architect, you know. So this is important. We have these two, let's say, natures of going into Palladio. Most people still today do not know that when Palladio died in 1580, very little was built. Most buildings were not finished in Vicenza. No? The basilica had only a very small part which was finished. They came with followers, they came Scamozzi, they finally built and built, you know. But Palladio in his own time, he could not see his work being realized, exception made by some famous buildings. But he was still an ongoing process, and we must say it in order to understand what the weight and the importance of this Quattro Libri were from the beginning in Fray Palladio himself. Okay, if you accept this double nature, as I call it, you know, we would say now, how does Palladio actually handle all these problems? And you should read only one text. Shouldn't read this book. You should read the first pages. It's 1.5 pages in the Quattro Libri. It's the Proemio, where Palladio explains by himself why he did it, how he came to do it, you know, how he came into architecture, what was his main convictions, and how he managed to do it, you know. And I can briefly say the most important things. They are, the first sentence is da naturale inclinazione. He says he was devoted. He had talents. He was convinced that he should make architecture. And then he names his authorities. He has authorities, you know. What is an authority? A value which he accepts, and he has different authorities. But all are always within the same group of authorities. Antiquity. What is antiquita? It's authority. It's Rome. It's whatever. He says later, he belongs to the second generation. The second generation who can take profit of all those forerunners who already did research on antiquity. So he can use what has been said, what has been drawn up. And he bases himself on all this material which is laid out, you know. So antiquita is it. But there are two parts of it. It's again the same. You have books and you have monuments, you know. So somehow what we see in the whole history, in the whole afterlife of Palladio is also his own life. His life is built up on a double experience, a double authority. He goes to see the monuments and he goes to read the books. You know. So It's also a classical antinomy, and before Palladio, everyone knew that this is not so easy. The books and what is written in the books in Vitruvius does not correspond to what you see in the Roman in Rome. There might be correspondence, but you have to make up what is between the two things. And this is why he says, I must study. He must study. He must try to get to understand the smallest detail of all that. So he describes this study process in steps. The first is misurare minutissimamente. So he goes very close to the object. He measures it up. Measuring is a way of getting very closely to a thing, like a natural scientist, goes very close. And the second is then he must comprendere. He must try to understand. What is understanding? Saying, well, this could be part of a column, or this might belong to that building. He tries to understand, and by understanding, he gives it that form which is understood. And what is it? The drawing. In disegno ridurlo. So you have three steps. He measures it up, he tries to understand, and he transfers it into drawing. Drawing is a way of understanding, but it's a way of codifying what you have understood. So you give it some kind of an artificial form, or you give it an abstract form, or you classify it, or you refer it to other similar forms which you might have from Vitruvius, for instance. So this is the whole process which Palladio develops. He is naturally very close to intellectuals. He is the guy who gives, or he makes the drawings for the most eminent edition of Vitruvius at the time, done by Daniele Barbaro. Daniele Barbaro, who does not necessarily quote anybody who helped him making this book, would make an exception, say, yes, Palladio was very important for me. He did the drawings for me. I couldn't have understood architecture if I did not have the help of Palladio, who made the drawings for my edition. So it is quite clear, make it very shortly. Drawing in that time is not simply copying what you see or rendering what you have in your eyes, but we would say in a modern way, it's a scientific process, going from an object which you analyze, which you understand, into its codification. You bring it into a valuable, specific form, and by that you can handle it. It's close to what a scientist would say. It's normative. A drawing becomes already normative. When Palladio draws such a thing, or as I must first say, when his forerunner in that Serlio makes such a drawing, he codifies and he says, this is a specific form, and by that he says, we could learn, or we could use, or we could copy, or we could take this form and integrate it in different contexts. Actually, I give you this example. You might know that Serlio is that guy who first publishes books on architecture with illustrations beyond Fra Gioconda's Vitruvio. And he is the first who publishes all this paperwork which was done in Rome, And Palladio knew these books and he could start from that. To give you an example how this works, Serlio, I don't know if anyone would be able to locate such a drawing. It's actually a detail of a bigger drawing. The big drawing reconstructs the Terme of Diocletian in Rome. It's a big building. But as Serlio says, there are some parts which are more complicated and must make it bigger. He makes somehow a blow-up of a part of a building as this particularly complicated, and says then, on the other hand, we must go on that way using these elements membro per membro, parte per parte. So the drawing is already analytical in that sense that it can take pieces, and define pieces as such. Later would come to such a part, later would say typology, whatever. He takes out pieces. If you look closely to such an xylography and engraving, you could easily see all these black parts are walls, you know. All these round little signs are columns, you know. And then you could also see that these walls are structured. They are always rectilinear, and sometimes they are curvilinear, you know. These are very regular forms. Sometimes you have diagonals. Sometimes you have a little bit distorted forms. But generally spoken, it's a very small number of different signs which compose these drawings, which corresponds to very complicated building, you know. So drawing is already codified. Drawing is codified as it goes also to the printer, and you could then now use such things. Now look at this, one of these early Palladian drawing for a villa. What does he do? He adapts, we would say in a modern way, he adapts this typology. He uses a very similar sequence, we would say, of spaces, you know, a small one, a bigger one, connected with still a bigger one, you know, which is drawn up in 3 parts. You can see the analogy of this design, but this is a totally different context. This is a small house. These were public buildings, bases, you know, and what actually Palladio learns is to take such elements and transpose them in a totally new context for his own use. I say it right now here. When Palladio tries to say what he achieved, he would later say, first, I did not achieve by myself. I was helped by gentiluomini. He has a clientele. He has friends who give him an opportunity to realize. And with this gentiluomini, he can then perform and make something new, what he always calls usanza nuova. When he uses things like that and transpose them in a very different context, he is creating something new, you know. It's a long discussion about imitation, whatever, but this is new. He gives all these antique forms a new way of being used, you know. In extreme cases, if you could go to the next, I guess. In extreme cases, this newness, no, I don't have it here. This newness will be, for instance, that he decides that the facade of a temple could also be a facade of my little house. Why not? He must simply make an operation with history. But he's very much aware that what he does and how he uses antiquity is not simply repeating antiquity, but is using all these elements, giving them a new significance or a new essence within his new context. If you consider that that drawings are of that kind, that we somehow decompose through the drawing antiquity or the ruins or the monuments and change them totally, we must go to the ground and say, yes, that's the reason why. You know, I compare here a very early illustration, an illustration of a very early edition of Vitruvius. This is from the edition of Vitruvius of 1497. At the time when Vitruvius did not yet have architectural illustrations, they had only mathematical illustrations. You know. But it tells you what is the base of all that. The base of all that is that by mathematical abstraction, you know, you can deduce from a concrete contextuality into something more general and readapt it again. It's exactly what the modern painter like Penck does. No? Don't know if you know Penck, this artist of my age. And he made a whole series of such schemes. And when he goes to say, I must find a scheme to symbolize theory, what does he make? He makes such spots here. They are arranged systematically somehow. He creates figures. So you see what mathematics gives you as a base. Mathematics is a way of putting elements in a regular way, arrange them in a regular way, or defining figures. What is a figure? Figure is some kind of a closed figure. Means different lines combined form a figure. Such a thing is a figure, but also a ground plan of a house is a figure. This is the base of going to the most abstract base in order to make something, to make it possible that something becomes systematic. Later, theorists have understood that Vitruvius by itself is full of information but has no scientific order. In order to get Vitruvius somehow usable, you must give it a scientific discipline. And how can you do it as an architect? You use Euclid. So if you have Vitruvius or Euclid, you have some kind of a synthesis of lots of knowledges and a little bit of systematic approach. If you combine systematics, Euclidean, geometry, with all your knowledge, you find your method, you find your way through into architecture. And in this way, you go in recomposing architecture from what you have found. You are not giving picture of Roman antiquities, but you're recomposing out of the elements which you identified in order to fit with what Vitruvius then describes. So you see how such simple things as a column is constructed. And you see these are not simply images, but they are constructed on the base of geometry. So this pedestal is a square. This diagonal gives you an indication that this is a square plus 1/3, let's say. Or this problem of this canellatura is designed very specifically. And in order to get this, even this form systematic, you add here this little square, so you know exactly how it is made, how it is geometrically put up. This is somehow a scientific approach to creating forms after having understood how they are, after having measured, after having understood, and now in bringing them into drawings. Or you do it with a temple facade, Again, it's not an image, it's all well constructed, element by element, to rules which you found in Vitruvius and which you can somehow also testify within your archaeological work. Okay, you see also what is not so easy to understand. Most books or most histories of architectural theory would always say, that's it, the architectural orders. Lesser historians of theory say, that's not all. You can also integrate facades in this system of your orders. You can integrate single forms as doors, as windows. And Palladios is actually a practical thinking architect who say we must go beyond. We must integrate any of the architectural requirements to get them within a method and handle them in that way. Okay, it's all about normative. It's all about how far can a historical issue become normative. Is history simply the succession of events? Is history the sum of all single elements? Or can you find within history something which is able to form your method, as does Linné, or as does then a historian like Serodajko. He simply piles up, puts up all possible columns and says, okay, we have some kind of system. Or you take Owen Jones, or you take the order. This is how to go into the systematic tradition of architecture. Okay, if this is somehow accepted, we can may go into the next step. What would then be the elements by which architecture is built up? First, I should say, within the very short text of Palladio, there's only one which makes a comment on that. And Palladio says in chapter 20 of book 1, all what we need is we must have some rules. Some rules. He doesn't even say which rules. It would be fine if we had some regole universali. We should have some rules which are good rules, which are valid rules, and he looks for it. And the quattrolib, the quality of the quattrolib is that this is not an incredible amount of knowledge or summed up analyses, but it's all about architecture which is sufficiently explained and always explained in the same similar forms of drawings, and the same similar drawings built up of the same same elements. So you see such a typical drawing again. You see this is beyond any doubt an absolutely sufficient depiction of a building, but it is very simple. You see there you find columns, you find the detailed forms, you have all, it's a geometric drawings, but it's absolutely sufficient. I put next to it a drawing of one of, let's say, the most orthodox theoreticians. It's Blondel, and if you say what the French, in the time of the French Academy, would outline as an architectural language, you would see it's still the same. You have circular forms for columns, and you have rectangular forms for walls, you know, and it's all about combining the different forms and making out of it a grammar or a syntax or ein Lehrgebäude, as they later would say. You know, it's all about having very few simple forms and combining them. You know. And this is still the case in this famous part here. And now you see what it is. The simpler such a grammar is, the more it is universal. Or you could also say the simpler or the more abstract it is, the less it is refused as being historically connotated. You know, so when Le Corbusier gives the schemes of his modular, he's naturally in that tradition to find sufficiently abstract forms which are still close enough to your perception of concreteness. You know, it's always between a sensation and an abstractness. It's never purely mathematical. It always appeals to you. This could be some kind of a physical combination. The same is here in Durand. He starts with the very abstract forms, and towards the very end, you have schemes which you know exactly. These must, yes, this is the analogon to the famous project of Behr, which he published, which became famous. So it's very architectural at this very end of the scheme, but all these architectural forms might be deduced from the very abstract form. So it's a way of combining the abstract and the concrete, or it's a way to go not to go to specific buildings, but still and again to build them up from the misurare minutissimamente, comprendere in disegno ridurre. Okay, this is the way how it is. It is beyond any doubt that Palladio thinks like that. He does. He has this way of analyzing forms and bringing into discussion such abstract forms. He also does what the later time would discover as typology. He has a very extensive discussion of what defines a Vitruvius. It is a form, or if you want a specific form for interiors, which you see here, all these different form of atri or interior cortile. There are different such forms described by Vitruvius, and Palladio reconstructs them all for the Vitruvian edition of Daniele Barbaro, and as they were not all finished when Barbaro published his Vitruvius, he added some others in the second edition, and he added even some others in his Quattro Libri. So he follows this going between of a totally abstract geometric device and an architectural form. It's always between. It's never too physical, but it's also never too abstract. Give you just another. These were the natural typological discussion in the 19th century after Durand and so on. Okay, now I switch to a modern. This was just to say how this between abstract and concrete is what you can find in Palladio himself. He develops it. He gives all means that somebody like Durand can switch to it, or that somebody who actually would develop typology could switch to it. But I jumped now into a more modern context. What happened in this late time? You should know these pictures. These were the illustrations which were added to the manifesto of Brutalism, published in the Architectural Review in 1955 here in London, where the Smithsons were, let's say, the avant-garde of the time. And when the Smithsons would present this project here, this was the project for Coventry Cathedral, which was a famous competition here in England. And Reyner Banham said, yes, this was the new neo-palladianism. Why? You see this, the form, we can now forget about this form, and we look to the plan. The plan looks really very mathematical, and it is clear, and the Smithsons by themselves said, yes, at that time we were following the courses of Rudolf Wittkower, and Wittkower at the time published this book, Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism, and this has probably been the art historical book which influenced most architects all over the century. And at the time, the Smithsons believed that this might be a way of going into contemporary architecture. Why? They believe in harmony, they believe in proportion, they believe that this could be value in a time when all values were lost. And they tried, and they did it, and it was commented by Reyner Banham as being neo-Palladian. But the problem is not resolved. The Smithsons then quitted very quickly this architecture, and Wittkower by himself tried to go a little bit in this direction, and what attracted most architects was this scheme. Wittkower made such a scheme within which he summed up the most important buildings, and you can see he made very abstract schemes. These schemes are linear, and they are, if you want, typological. They have only the staircases as concrete elements, and the rest is really linear. There's the Villa Rotonda. They're all the specific villas, and what he attempted, he tried to say, or he tried to suggerire, he tried to make clear or to propose that behind all those concrete villas or buildings were a common scheme, and he added it here. It is the last scheme, which he calls a pattern. It's a geometrical pattern. Historians attacked Wittkower and said, no, Palladio had never a pattern. Palladio does not speak about the pattern. It's your interpretation that something might be behind it as a general rule. Palladio spoke about regula universale, but he never named what such a rule would be. So it was a modern interpretation, and the modern mind tried to find out a universal rule, which was also very concrete, which was could have been identified geometrically in that side. That Wittkower did such a thing was not so totally out of context. If you go back again to Searle, it is clear that every architect used Euclid, every architect looked to ground forms. Searle gave that side of schemes by which he gave a whole series of different sizes of rectangular forms between 1 square and 2 squares, just to give a choice to an architect. But again, it's not saying this one is the best. He gives a variety, whereas the modern tries to give an interpretation also to Palladio as being fixed on specific rules. At the time was a big debate, or let's say more than a debate, some kind of great difficulty between Wittkower and Colin Rowe. And Colin Rowe had a grant at the time. He studied also Wittkoverian Palladian elements. And Colin Rowe went into a different direction. And Colin Rowe, let's put that here, Colin Rowe was more radical in trying to say that this is a rule which we must now find for modern architects. Wittkower simply said, yes, we could eventually have a pattern, a geometric pattern, and Colin Rowe said, yes, Palladio is dogmatic. Palladio is that architect who has this strength of dogmatism. Burkhardt said it also. And as it is like that, we can use it as a solid base for, what for? For making projects. And he made this famous analogy between the Villa Malcontenta and the Villa Garches, the Villa Stein in Garches by Le Corbusier. And he said, this equals, this is equal, and it is equal as it does absolutely, as it is absolutely identical as to its harmonious geometric ground plan. So this, what was it? Is it a Palladian explanation of Le Corbusier, or is it simply a legitimation of modern architecture being based as solidly on proportion as any other architecture? You must know that naturally after 45, architecture was in a crisis, and what could have been a common denominator, harmony could be, proportion could be. People believed in proportion. In Milano in 1951 was a conference where all people came. Max Bill came, Gideon came, Le Corbusier came, proposed this modular, and Wittkower came and proposed his books. People say that they spoke together, but this was not the game. The game is that at that moment, Palladio could be of actuality, as people believed that Palladio was that architect who integrated better than anyone else this proportional geometry on this proportion as a device of a project. Okay, this was an interpretation, and this is most of the time believed being the only interpretation of Palladio in modern times. I should say that naturally this had a great success. It had a success in didactics. What you see here on the left is a scheme from a friend of Colin Rowe, who was that teacher in ETH Zurich, and you could easily see he uses all this Palladian architecture. He takes it, let's say, as the base of geometric device, but it goes further, you know. And this also you should acknowledge, all this abstract process of making project had this common source of going with Palladio, or by or through Palladio, in the total abstractness of geometric science to be used as elements by which going into new composition and buildings. This is beyond any doubt what happened. Proportion, harmony was the issue of the day, and from this you could go on into such schemes and others and further developments. What has been forgotten most of the time is that Palladio had not only this abstract side, but it had also the physical side. I don't know if you know this building. This was the first official architecture produced by the Bauhaus in Weimar, the so-called Versuchshaus, and it's quite clear that this is inspired by the organization of the Villa Rotonda, but that has no cupola. It is very small. It was a Versuchshaus, but it tried to combine abstract geometry with the physical tradition of Palladio. And in order to understand, one must know that Palladio was very much in the center of discussion when people like Messel or Peter Behrens tried to find a way to go against historical forms or historical styles, still making solid architecture, going to a classical direction and going to, let's say, an architecture beyond time and history. And this is Messel's Pergamon Museum. Messel is described by Walter Behrens. Walter Behrens is that guy who describes the Waisenhof-Ausstellung in Stuttgart, who always followed all these things. And Behrens would then say Messel was that innovator who went beyond history and found a new morality and found a new value of architecture. But you see, these are the two, let's say, the two ways of modernity. You become modern by abstractness. So give you this example. Or you go modern by making abstraction of physical elements. And when you go to such a comparison, you can see what I mean. This naturally, it's a Palladian building, is not seen by people like Peter Behrens as being a Doric order, but he says simply, these are abgestufte Reliefvorstellungen. So the issue is not the concrete form and its historically correct interpretation as Doric, Ionic. No, it is the way the physical architecture is emerging, the way of the fact that that there is relief, the fact that there is something coming out of that wall which produces shadow, for instance, is the Miesian discussion. Mies comes out from Behrens and not necessarily from abstraction. And you see, on the other hand, how Le Corbusier deals with it. Le Corbusier, as you know, has these principles which he defines very early, and one principle is volume. It's physics, it's Körper, and it's not abstractness. So it's going between abstractness, but whenever you make architecture, you will have material. You must transform this material into form, and you have to decide where you situate your form. Is it closer to abstractness? Is it closer to concreteness? It's all about going between these two ways. This antagonism has been, let's say, the crux of modern architecture since ever. Historical would then be seen from a modern point of view, using all these forms, using all the different styles, from Egyptian to Gothic. The architect is watching all that. And the modern architecture would overcome all these forms, as Guidi would place it, giving an interpretation to the Bauhaus in Dessau by Gropius, where he says, it took a long time to get material and form being one and the same. And what is left over is, in the terms of Gideon, Spannungen, tensions. And he says tensions is a means of aesthetics. It's pure form, it's aesthetics, and the physical form somehow disappears when it comes to that what then has been depressed and has raised again with what we call postmodern or whatever you want it to call. There are very few examples where you could say some architects find a synthesis of all this modern discussion to overcome historical forms, still being within contextuality which we could call Palladian, as Palladian did by himself look for abstractness, as Palladio was defining nuova usanza, new forms of houses. This, that unique example of Reichel and Reinhardt, which they built in the 70s in the Canton Ticino, where they tried not simply to make abstract architecture, but they used also symbols. They put this little triumphal arch before that abstract house, just to remind that Palladio also put the facciata dinanti, as he calls it. He uses a facade, as he says, yes, I have this symbol, I give it to the house. You can put there, let's say, your address, or you could put a sign that people would recognize who is living in a house. A very simple way of conceiving the necessity of a facade. And the typology, naturally, is that of the Villa Rotonda. But again, no cupola, no historical signs, but it maintains the value of not simply the abstractness as such, but abstract in specific form or in specific typology. Okay, I don't know if you can follow me a little bit. I try to say that in order to understand why Palladio in modern times had such a long, created so many debates over, always discussed, Peter Eisman discusses Palladio, Colin Rowe discusses Palladio. Everyone cannot not take into account this huge impact of Palladio. And the reason why is not simply as he's famous or he has been known better than other architects, but the reason is in Palladio's own way of handling history. Again, he has these two ways of conceiving of approaching architecture. He has his physical architecture. He has the Quattro Libri, has this abstracted form which he gives in the book. These are two different approaches. He by himself knows that he decomposes architecture in order to liberate the single elements, or as you could say, the method of making or the design process. He developed the design process out of antiquity. He was not satisfied with antiquity as such. This was the modern way of Palladio going into his way. If I should say what was actually the result of Palladio's architect, again I would say he created not simply imitating antiquity architecture, he created something new. He adapted also all to what at that time was requested by his gentiluomini, meaning houses. The house is the issue of modern architecture, not the palace, une maison, un palais, the famous polemics of Corbusier. He had foreseen that in order to discuss architecture, you had to go to the elemental means of architecture, which he identified in the house. But he didn't make a hut, but he integrated all elements which he find in antiquity in his idea of a house, as you can see here. The temple is your house, or the facade of the temple has become an element of your house. This is why Palladio is so important. Okay, architecture and the Quattro Libri. I said at the beginning, so many architects did not see buildings by Palladio. They only had the Quattro Libri. This might have helped this way going into the abstractness. We heard from Goethe that he said, you cannot go to Palladio without seeing what he really did. So this belongs, or this is, or is still a bias, or this is still a contradiction in itself. I always was so surprised seeing that Le Corbusier, whom we know is that person who is more explicit than any other architect in the 20th century, who writes more than any other, that he does not so explicitly speak about Palladio. He speaks about Michelangelo, the drama, whatever, but he does not speak so much on Palladio, but he gives an image of Palladio. And this image is actually the Villa Rotonda, which he adds at the very end of an article in which the word Palladio does not occur. So he leaves it open. But when we look to this paper, which is actually on pérennité, Le Corbusier is speaking not of history, but speaking of the lasting of architecture, the eternity, or the everlasting value of architecture, where he discusses bridges or the Colosseum. At the very end appears this Villa Rotonda, and the sentence before that, after having spoken about the technique of bridges, the calcul of all this eminent modern building, he speaks about the architecture au-delà du calcul. So he reserves himself saying, as he says in his famous definition, the architecture naturally will never be that modern technical engineer who creates all out of his calculations. The architecture will remain that guy who combines the knowledge with his form, or he still makes art. Art is, as Daniele Barbaro says, nasce ogni arte dall'esperienza. So it's still the architect who experiences who is caught in. It's still the architect who makes architecture. It's not the drawing maker. It's, I'm sorry to say, Peter Eismann is on the wrong side seen from that point of view. He makes very nice drawings, but his architecture, no, Palladio stands for not the drawing. The drawing is a means to go to architecture, and Corbusier would comment the Villa Rotem by saying, yes, it's au-delà du calcul. Architecture is architecture. It's only a matter of trying to go beyond the context, but whenever you make your architecture, you're naturally caught in history and in the concreteness of architecture. Okay, I don't know if you could follow a little bit my attempt to go through the abstractness by which Palladio handled his antiquity, which made it easier for modern architecture to deal with Palladio, from the most abstract people like Durand to Colin Rowe to Whitcover to our own present. I still know some architects who are inspired by Palladio, but I don't think about those architects who, when the last Jubilee was in 1980, all were making models of Palladio. That was just a moment of typologies. Everyone drawing Palladio. I guess this new Jubilee of 2008 has happily not have this outcome, but I guess we all should go and try to learn within Palladio how he conceives architecture and how he develops his method of design. Okay, thank you very much. I hope you understood a few things.
Do you have any questions? Anyone?
My name is Nicola Ray, and my name is Nicola Ray, and I have been researching for the last 15 years my own appreciation of the similarity between classical architecture and modern architecture in certain ways. There are two things that I'm very interested in what you have said. First of all, you mentioned at the very beginning that Palladio wrote very little about his buildings, and that he meant the drawings and the buildings to express themselves and to be the final idea of what he was saying. Now, I am really, really surprised to see your abstractions as from Colin Rowe and Whitcover and everybody else, and I am absolutely shocked to my very core that that the profession has accepted these as suitable interpretations of Palladio, and I want to know how you feel about that.
I tried to be. Can you hear me? Yes. I tried to be more gentle. Naturally, I'm shocked too, but I'm a historian, so I must see what happened. And it is so clear that even Whitcover, who was such a solid historian, even Whitcover could be tempted to abstract from the schemes a geometrical pattern. You know. I'm shocked too. It's wrong. Naturally, it's wrong. But in the 50s, there was such a need to go to a fundamental law of architecture. They all believed in proportion. It's an old discussion in the 18th century too. So they went to the scheme, you know. But if you're shocked or not, it happened like that. But I must give you another answer. Just written a piece and there. The name classical, naturally, is a modern interpretation. Most of our terms, such as baroque, classic, are modern inventions which we projected back to history. The name classical, Palladio would never say classical. Palladio speaks only about antiquity. So he has a name to denote all those monuments. He does not have a name to make out abstraction of it. He doesn't have a classical ideal. The first real important book on classical within the history of art was Wölflin, when he wrote in 1899 Das Klassische. and it starts saying, klassisch hat für uns etwas Erkältendes. It's freezing, you know. So classical was a kind of psychological means of going into abstract architecture. Abstract is not very warm, you know. Abstract is cold, abstract is cool, whatever. So we are in a modern world in the midst of such ideas. But these ideas are modern. This opposition, classical modern, is a modern connection. And the modern made this division of history versus modern, or classical versus Baroque, or classical versus Gothic, you know. In Palladio's time, there was antiquity. Yes. And antiquity was concrete. But he, in order to develop a design method, you know, made his, we would say, abstractions, you know. He said, okay, for a column I take a line, or I use symbols, you know. Geometry helps me to replace things by symbols. And I can build a language out of symbols. This kind of abstractions Palladio made beyond any doubt, and all made them, all the Vitruvian, those who made interpretation of Vitruvius made it. You know. But again, I can follow you that this is absolutely shocking. Correctly said it too, you know? But it is a fact that Palladio was used by this way. And this is why I tried to add in this book a long chapter that it is not the only way of dealing with Palladio in modern times. There were others who took it physically, you know, who said, no, we must take Palladian architecture as it was, physically, you know. There are two streams, but I guess I ask you, I guess we still have not overcome in our time this division, you know, of modern being abstract and historical being physical. You know. We still have this kind of this huge antagonism, you know, exception made by many, you know. So we have a problem.
There are two things that I'd like to put in. One is what becomes of Pache, because when you looked, when you showed us the drawings, the plans by Serlio and by Palladio, it's evident that those thick walls have figures in themselves, and in the modern plan, the wall has no figure in itself. It's really just a registration of a barrier, a line, a screen, because in the modern plan, so often the real event is the frame. This is in turn connected with the sense in so many modern plans that the event really is the space, Raum, from Schmazov, that is in some sense expanded and flowed in such a way that the poche is diminished. Now, that's one thing. The second thing is that in Rowe, in comparing the ideal villa and Corbusier, he differentiates between those harmonics of the plan and those of the elevation, which are not quite so reducible to a diagram, and which in turn imply for Corbusier, at least, the problems of depth and of transparency, virtual, and so on. So I wonder if you could comment on that.
Okay, I agree totally. Naturally, you go now on and say Colin Rowe naturally was not so totally dogmatic as I said it. You know, it's absolutely true. He went on, and I guess seeing your age, you remember as I do, when the poche was rediscovered, and Colin Rowe played an important role. Every architectural school spoke about poche. That was a very fashionable thing. I don't know if you know what is poche. No, actually, this filling. You know, this filling. People rediscovered, and somebody had to rediscover history in order to replace it. You know, when they saw that there's thickness of walls. You know, it's so straight. It has to do with your question too. when people rediscovered that architecture is not simply abstractness, but has material value, this was an event. It was a step of overcoming some kind of modern interpretation of modern ideology. But I say some as most architects had to handle all these materials, But in their heads, it was this line. Or think about how many people still today say, oh yes, my facade is transparent, it's all of glass. And then you go and it's full of metal work which is not so transparent. I do not like the word ideology, but it has become an ideology that architecture actually is without dimension, without extension, without physicality. And you said something very important. It has always been a great discussion. Do we speak about space, or do we speak about corporality? Schmarzo is one of those persons who developed notion of space. But then he would say, like Colin Rowe, Schmarzo speaks also about corporality. It is an issue. In my generation, most architects, if you ask them, what is architecture? The first word would be space. No? Is it space? Space is what results, would we say. But before you have space, you must define your walls, So this is another antinomy, is this correct? An antinomy within our architectural speaking, within our architectural terminology. Do we speak about space? Do we speak about the walls? Do we speak about the portrait or the lines? How much do we use the abstractness of science? And how much we know that there must be, every abstractness must have a physical correspondence. In all Albrecht Dürer, when he starts to make his book on Unterweisung der Messung, his first treatise on geometry, he says, oh, I have a problem. I cannot draw a line as actually, if I follow Euclid, a line is the shortest distance between 2 points, has no extension. So I must cheat. I must give this invisible line a little bit of physicality in order to make it sensible. So architects always knew, or every artist always knew, there's always a big issue between our senses, das Leibseele, our sensitivity, and the desire of abstractness. It's always a correspondence, what you can see and what you have abstract. And then I would say, Palladios is it his merit or is it he never defines himself dogmatically. As I said, he says, yes, would be nice if he had some rules, but he's between, and he's a practical architect. I guess we should really say he's a practical architect. If you go to Daniele Barbaro, the theoretician, and look in his poem what he says about architecture, he says, architecture naturally is not mathematics. Architecture takes part of mathematics to become more scientific, but architecture is a domain of an artist. Le Corbusier in early time would have said métier. It's what you can. It's your competence of doing, And actually, we had many misunderstandings in recent times about what an architect is, We have seen architects who were only theoreticians, and we have had also architects who were totally disinterested in theory. And this synthesis of having in mind your theory and being able to do, that's rare. It's difficult, But I guess we have these problems in our modern tradition beyond any doubt. There's so many different positionings between abstract and concrete, between history, no history, between abstractness and space and body, So I guess both these questions say us something about the difficulties which we have, or if I may invert it, say as why Palladio could be so interesting, in dealing with, in spite of the misunderstandings, But if I may add, I tried to understand, I mean, why Wittcover did it, or why Colin Rowe did it. Should I say that? Colin Rowe, you eventually knew him. Colin Rowe, when he published it, or Alexander Karagon, when he published when Colin Rowe died, some of his writings were published. And there were also writings which he did a few years before he died. These were memories. And one of those memories is when he says, I traveled to Italy. And he traveled to Italy, and in Florence, he knew a Californian architect, a Beaux-Arts architect. When he says at the time Beaux-Arts architect, old-fashioned, But this Beaux-Arts architect had emotions, and he said, Colin, you must come with me to Rome. I saw a church that is absolutely important. Come on, And then Colin Rowe, with this California, they go to Rome, and they visit Santa Maria in Campitelli. Santa Maria in Campitelli is a famous Baroque church. For architects, it was always the best Baroque church, as it is so dynamic in its plan, And then Colin Rowe describes what he did in this church. They looked at it and said, oh, marvelous. Is that strong, whatever? But behind it is Wittcover made research on that church. Colin Rowe knew that. So it was all known research. And Colin Rowe then writes, I dissimulated any knowledge. And what is behind it? Behind this is that belief that it's another modern antinomia. You can only have emotions if you don't know. You must be naive in order to have emotions, So an artist has emotions and does not know. A historian does know he has no emotions. He cannot become an artist. And Colin Rowe found out the names of these two different activities. And he said, there is studio language. That's when I'm teaching design. Nobody controls me, say yes. And then Michelangelo was drunk, and then he said, there's no control about the truth of your history. The important is simply that you can engage a young student and say, isn't that great? That's studio language. And then is the historian, and the historian is correct, but what he does serves only erudition. So Colin Rowe, it's also descriptive. He separates knowledge and making art. It's for me personally, it's one of the biggest gaps in our recent history. History of history. That we have knowledge which we cannot use. Knowledge is for knowledge. The historians exchange footnotes to each other. And the artists are not interested. It's a wrong word. We must mix the two things. And Colin Rowe was aware, but also Wittcover was aware about this problem. And Wittcover had this unique moment that his book was accepted by the Smithsons. That must have been a great moment. Rarely an art historian can see that the book is somehow accepted by an architect. It's always too scholarly made and whatever. So we have a gap between knowledge and art. Okay, so what I tried to say, we have many crises in modernity, and we still did not overcome those crises. This is probably why we are still in a modern time.
Thank you. Can you please clarify your position and your argument towards the Casatoni you show? Because I didn't catch one.
My position? Well, I like very much Bruno Reichlin. You see, emotion. No, I find this house, if I should, let's say, name a house to describe what the discussion was before postmodern became a label, it is the midst of the 70s. And in 1980, the Strada Novissima in the Venice Biennale made postmodern architecture a name. No? This was before. But if I should give an example where this process of trying to integrate historical knowledge, into a modern tradition, I would say it's one of the rare examples where this worked out. You should know that it is older than Unger's sketches and houses which he built in that kind. It was an outcome. And you know that Reichlin and Reinhardt, they were very close to Aldo Rossi. So you have to understand it out from that tradition. But I guess this was an important work, and at the time, so many people went there to try to understand. They were shocked by this art. But you see, I'm a historian. I have no emotions. But I believe that this is real. I would say you should go and see it. It's one of the things which is helped a discussion go a step further, And the two are, as you might know, Reichlin and Reinhardt, they're such friends, and they are separated since a long time. And Bruno Reichlin still is one of the best thinkers amongst architects of that generation. Is this satisfying?
Yeah, I'm going to look to the project because I'm not really convinced from what you're saying. I'm going to look to the project carefully.
Yes, okay.
Could I ask you, one thing you made, you seem to differentiate between absolute abstraction and abstraction from, and that was the point where you contrasted Eisenman with Messel, I think, something like that. I mean, sounds a little bit like the difference between analytical cubism and synthetic cubism. But I don't know really, I'd like you to develop this because I'm not sure I buy it.
Naturally, as you quoted it, I was very superficial by putting Messel and Eisenman. But behind this is a distinction. And if you say cubism, analytic, synthetic, that's the real point. I mean, we all agree that out of cubism came what we called modern, and it had to do with abstractness. And we know that very early people said Cézanne, and later cubism is architectural and abstract. But I have an answer, a concrete answer. Léonce Rosenberg, who was the guy who made these exhibitions, also for the group Desdale, who made the exhibitions for Purisme. He wrote a little piece which was published in the first issue of Esprit Nouveau, Parlant Peinture. He also made a separate publication. And there he quotes Braque. And Braque says, what does he say? If I make a first comment to Bureau, I say, look these diagrams. But when I go into a more careful analysis, I said diagrams, but I meant something which is a little bit different, Is this? I make a small. If I can make a small, I worked on that very hard. Architectural theory very early discovered that terminology is important, and it has to do with Vitruvius. Vitruvius is written in Latin, but already Alberti said, it's Greek, and the Greeks say it's Latin, so it's not clear. And one of the first comments on Vitruvius was a book which was only or exclusively terminology by Philandrier. And what does Philandrier make? This is against me now. He makes exactly what you did by quoting the diagram. He says, I cannot make a distinction here unless I invent a different word. And he invented a different word, but he took it out of the Greek, and he said, he made a distinction between graphé, graphic, and grammé, and said, graphé is just a drawing, and grammé is the geometrical, correct mathematical drawing. So you see, people invented notions in order to be able to make distinctions. So Mike, again, again, I apologize for my impreciseness, but when we go into historical text, it is useful that we make this kind of distinction. Is this?
I think we should take this opportunity to thank you for a very charismatic lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.